thank you, for joining this virtual teacher workshop. Like we said, we know it's been a really tough year, and also this is towards the end of the semester. So we know it's a really challenging time. So really appreciate both the presenters and also all of you to show up and then to participate. We hope this would be very valuable to you. My name is Meng Wang. I am the K-12 Outreach Coordinator with the Confucius Institute at University of Utah. So our institute is primarily focused on Chinese language learning and teaching and a cultural exchange. So we're very privileged to kind of host this teacher workshop with the Office for Inclusive Excellence. I think Liz Rogers is associated with the office, OIE. We're really happy to have her with us today to present on two workshops. Am I frozen?
Slightly, a little broken up, but I think you're okay.
Slightly? Okay.
Okay, yeah. We heard, I think we heard everything. Do you want me to
I'll finish this really quickly.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll finish this part really quickly. I'll probably jump in, and then I think somebody else is also a host as well. So I don't think it's going to close off the meeting. So yeah, anyway, so I think I'm going to hand over the time to Liz. And Liz, can you please kind of introduce Office for Inclusive Excellence and also yourself a little bit before we starting the workshop today?
Yes, that's my pleasure to do that. Thank you for having us. It's myself and Ella who will introduce herself in a minute. So we both work in the Office for Inclusive Excellence. I also work in the Center for Teaching and Learning around inclusive teaching strategies and just working on how to teach better and create inclusive climates in our classrooms, teach diverse groups of students. But the Office for Inclusive Excellence in particular really focuses on campus climate. How are people experiencing their lives and their work and their learning on campus? And so that's our job. We do lots, it's an education-based entity on campus. We do lots of workshops and lots of work around just helping folks with resources on how to solve problems around equity and inclusion. And we also house the bias incident reporting system, so we can talk a little bit about that today as well. And so, yeah, I'm Liz, and I'm happy to be here. And I'm also here with my colleague, Ella.
Hi, I'm Ella. She, her, hers are great pronouns for me, and I work with Liz in the Office for Inclusive Excellence. I've been here in Salt Lake for about 11 years now. Came here to work on my undergraduate degree in 2009 and thought I'd be here for 2 years, and it stuck, so I'm still here. Before working in my current role, I worked in the LGBT Resource Center for a number of years. I worked in a local nonprofit for a little while after graduation.
Okay. Well, thanks for having us again. So what we're going to do today, we are trying to combine essentially 2 1.5-hour workshops into one. So we'll just kind of see how it flows. We're going to start with talking a little. We do bias and microaggressions workshops a lot in our office. And so we'll talk a bit about that. And then we'll move into talking a little bit about inclusive teaching. And I can tell you that we definitely won't have time to get through everything that we would like to cover, but hopefully there'll be some sparks, there'll be some questions. Those of you that are teaching, is everyone in the Zoom call? Is everyone teaching in the spring? Does everyone know a little bit?
I'm not teaching, but sometimes I work with students.
I see a thumbs up from you. Do you pronounce it Yunabin?
Oh, Yuan Bing.
Yuan Bing. Okay.
Thank you.
Yuan Bing, thumbs up. So he's teaching. They're teaching in the spring. Anyone else teaching in the spring? Okay, sort of. Some Maribel. Okay, we got some thumbs up. Okay, so this is great because for sure. I know that over the break you will be working on your syllabus and thinking about your class and thinking about what went well or didn't go so well in the virtual world in the fall, and what you might like to change or shift towards your teaching in the spring. So let's, definitely address as many questions as we can as we move through this content. So let's dive in. So Ella's going to do a brief discussion about agreements, about talking. Do we want to do, maybe it's so short, maybe, do you want to do that, Ella, just briefly? Or I know we are rapidly running out of time, but what do you think?
I always joke when other people do it, but here I'm doing it. So I forgot to unmute myself. I think if we're going to prioritize some time, I would rather we get folks talking to each other. Maybe we just do a quick 5-minute breakout.
Okay.
Is that okay with that prompt? And then we can just go from there. It doesn't look like I can break folks into breakout rooms. Is that something you can do, Liz?
I don't see breakout. Can you do that?
Yeah, I can do that. I think I just made Gabriella co-host as well. I think Liz
I don't know
should be
if co-hosts
also
can do that.
Okay.
Oh, let's see more. No, I think you have, it's so confusing. I always thought co-hosts could do that, but maybe we can't. Can you, so there's 12 of us. Can you maybe just break us into groups of 3?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Actually, I just realized I made you the host and now I cannot do it. Sorry. I thought we can have 2 hosts or 3 more hosts at the same time. But
okay, here we are, breakout rooms. Okay, so before I do that, Ella, do you want to give a prompt?
Yeah, sure. So we'll just do 5 minutes. Big believer in communal learning. I think we can learn a lot from each other, and there's a lot of experience and expertise in this room that Liz and I don't have. And so the quick prompt, just to get us thinking about biases, to get us thinking about especially the cumulative nature of microaggressions and how they build over time. The prompt is to talk about a question or comment, a personal question or comment that you're tired of being asked, or that you wish you wouldn't be asked again. And we can kind of unpack that a little bit when we get back. So 5 minutes, just make sure that each of you get a chance to share, and then we'll unpack together. All right, thanks.
Okay, let's put Jeanette, we're putting you in assigned to room 3. Jeanette, you're going to a breakout room.
Oh, Jeanette, can you hear me now?
Jeanette, you're going to a breakout room. Are you ready?
Oh, it looks like they already met.
Okay, should we, oh, and it looks like it's a 20-minute, I don't know what, it was the default 20-minute breakout room.
Yeah, you gotta toggle it.
I'll broadcast message to all, and then do you want to each dive into somewhere? Are you able to, should I assign, do I need to assign you somewhere? Yeah, okay.
I think I've already been assigned. Usually I just let them talk just so that they can talk to each other, but.
They don't want to talk to us yet. Okay. I'm gonna broadcast a message saying it's not 20 minutes.
So I'll just unpack that, and then we can just dive into the whiteboard activity since we're short on time.
That it does seem that spending time with that, maybe, I think you're right on that.
All right. Hello to those watching on YouTube. Sorry. With it being recorded.
There's people watching on YouTube?
They're going to post it to YouTube, they said in the chat. So when these are being recorded, everyone's just watching us sit here.
Okay. So we'll unpack what they talk about.
And I'll just segue over to bias and power, and then you can take on the whiteboard, and then.
Okay. I'll do the whiteboard and then the stroll. I think we're going to have very little time for inclusive teaching, but especially since we're starting a little late.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah, I'll try and go as quick as I can. I noticed that the scroll that we had in the PowerPoint was only a few slides, so I think that'll help.
Yeah. And then I'll just try to focus. I might just focus on the syllabus. It's probably all the time that we'll have. Instead of trying to focus on all kinds of things, I'll just
if we need to drop the last part about the reporting tool, that's okay. It's a little bit in flux anyway. So
yeah, I'm excited to hear more about what's happening with that. That's seems great that it's more you know, more folks involved, or more widespread, or whatever the word is. I was going to say universal, but that's
I'm
not.
hoping it's a little bit more user friendly and that the work happens on the back end.
Yeah. So Brian Hubane is kind of spearheading that.
No, other Brian. So Brian Nichols.
That's probably not a good word. I'm trying to really observe the violent language that comes, spearheading.
Yeah, we have a very militaristic culture. It's
true. I've been observing some of the like mind blowing, or some of that language, like no.
Yeah, no, it's Brian Nichols. He used to work in OEO and now working in public safety.
Okay.
So yeah, so he's taken the lead on that, and so is Annalisa Purser. Annabelle Scheinberg. It's been a while since she doesn't even work on campus. I don't know why that name came to mind.
What do you need? Looking for Cora's shoes. She's 7. She should know where her shoes are. Okay, I think we're there. I said 4 minutes.
Sounds great.
Okay. Oh, they close in 10 seconds. Yeah, that's terrible. Usually, I mean, it just needs to be set up right. Okay.
Welcome back, everybody.
Sorry to all of you that got cut off. 10 seconds. Usually it's a 60-second warning, and 10 seconds is like so short. Sorry.
Did everyone get a chance to share? Okay, if not, feel free to share first right now. But does anyone want to share one that they came up with in their group?
Well, we were in the middle of our, so we kind of needed a little bit more of time to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you want to share one, Carrie?
No, Jeanette was starting to explain like how she feels about her students, and we were kind of having like a conversation about her students asking if they were asked to do things because they were brown,
Oh, okay.
And she was questioning if that was because I don't know, we were just talking about if her students were asking that. She wonders why her students ask that, I guess.
Okay.
And I was just giving her my opinion about it. That was it.
Okay. Did you want to share a little bit more about that, Jeanette, or you definitely don't have to. So trust is a contextual thing. What we feel comfortable sharing with 2 people isn't what we share with the rest of the group. But if you feel comfortable.
Jeanette, you're muted.
Oh.
There we go. It's that we don't have a huge Hispanic population in our school. And maybe it's just because we live in a small town, and some of them do feel discriminated against. But sometimes, I mean, I don't feel like I've given them any reason to say, that I feel like I've treated them with just the same respect I have everybody else. But it's almost like they're looking for a reaction, and they're just kind of waiting waiting for somebody to slip up so that they can call them out on it. And I kind of think it's kind of an attention thing.
So,
And,
Jeanette,
you know, but I definitely want to be aware, and I want them to be able to feel, you know, not discriminated against. But
right.
it's hard to help them to realize that when sometimes they just are trying to get you to discriminate.
Well, that's a little problematic. I would push back on that just a
I
little
would
bit.
too. Too.
But before we go there, so we'll unpack some of that maybe a little bit with the little time we have. But I did want to ask if you addressed the prompt, which was, do you have a personal question or comment that you're tired of being asked? So before we talk about a hypothetical other and unpack whether or not somebody is rightfully offended or oppressed, I want you to think about your own experiences.
So are you talking about a question that the students have or the question that I have?
No, so just for you, is there
okay.
a question?
I
or
thought it was the students. And so I
okay.
thought it was like, oh, are you asking me to do that because I'm brown? That's exactly. So yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So
I didn't, I was thinking of it from a student perspective, not mine. So I messed up on the prompt, sorry.
So that question of, are you just asking me that because I'm brown? That might stem from a microaggressive question being asked over and over again that a person doesn't know is offensive, that doesn't know maybe that it's attached to a bias and power. And so is asking it thinking that there's nothing connected to that. And so when a student says, are you asking me that because I'm brown? They might be trying to tell you that what was just asked is something that they get asked a lot and that it might be microaggressive. So that is a good example possibly, but I want you to think about something you're asked. So something that you're asked that you're tired of being asked. Does anybody have an example of that? Yeah, Carrie.
Well, I have like a couple of examples, I guess. For some reason, every time, like it has happened more than once when I have gone to shop and then the cashier asked me, "Where's your accent from?"
Mm-hmm.
And at first I used to take it more personal. Right now I'm more used to it. But sometimes I wonder, what does that matter, you know, like in the first place? But sometimes people just wants to speak Spanish, maybe.
Right.
Some of them, who knows? You know, I was having this conversation with my in-laws and I was like, I don't know when someone is asking me this just to start like an argument or not. And then sometimes when I say, oh, I am from Mexico, they say, oh, you don't sound Mexican. And that to me, it's offensive. You
Yeah,
know, it's like, well, in Mexico, we have different type of accents. There's a lot of linguistic diversity, you know, in that sense. But sometimes I don't feel like having that conversation with people and having to explain them that things are not black and white. It gets tiring, honestly.
That's a perfect example, Carrie. Thank you. And there's a few things that I want to unpack really quickly with the time we have. But one thing that I think is key to what you were sharing is that when we're talking about microaggressions, it's important that we separate out intent and impact, right? And so a person might be asking you that for the first time and they don't see any harmful impact. They're just curious or something else, right? But a microaggression, part of a symptom of a microaggression is that might be their first time asking, but it's probably your 100 millionth time being asked it. And so it builds over time. It's this, sometimes people call it death by a million paper cuts. So the one doesn't hurt as much, but over time it's just like, can I just go shopping without being asked about my accent, right?
Exactly.
So that's part of the nature of a microaggression. The other thing in what you shared that I think is really important for us to hold on to is that microaggressions aren't a list of good words and bad words or good questions and bad questions. It's a context question, right? So that question of, oh, can you tell me a little bit about your accent? There is a context in which that doesn't feel hurtful, in which it's an okay question to ask, but probably not from a stranger in a supermarket, right? So like, that's probably not the context. And so we want to be mindful of trust. We want to be mindful of relationship. And lastly, we want to be mindful of entitlement. So especially when we're coming from a dominant cultural perspective. In the US, that would be English as a first language, whiteness, to name a couple. We need to be mindful of the fact that we need to check our entitlement. Just because I'm curious doesn't mean I get to know, right? And so sometimes we don't do a good enough job of checking our entitlement to our questions and realizing that I don't get to ask questions of everybody I see all the time. I'm curious about every one of you. I want to know everything about your lives. I'm a water sign. I love to hear about your background and life, right? But just because I want to doesn't mean I get to, right? And so it's thinking about context, it's thinking about trust and relationship, to name a couple. Yeah, Menki.
Yeah, I have
Did
a
I pronounce
question.
that correctly?
It's Mengqi.
Mengxi? Okay.
Yeah, yeah, no worries. Thank you for asking. I have a question, just to follow up on that, right? So, because I think what Carrie mentioned is a very typical example that we talk a lot about, that people get to ask, either where you're from or what's your accent, all of that. And I think you made a very good point about, just because you want to, you're curious, you don't necessarily get to ask that kind of question. Especially there's considering the power dynamic between, the dominant culture and the non-dominant culture. So is there any, I was wondering if there's any way to respectfully ask that, while also giving people the option, or making people realize that I'm also taking into account that, you don't have to answer that, or, like how do we, is there a way to accommodate all of that? If I still kind of, you're just curious about the person, I want to get to know them more, how do I approach that?
I think our focus today is going to be a little bit more on how to respond when folks ask and say microaggressive things. Actually, probably not today. In a 90-minute workshop just about microaggressions, that's what we dedicate our time to. Today, we'll talk a little bit about that. I will just say, because you asked, I want to respect that question, that the short version of that is it's important to have a reason that is valid and isn't just voyeuristic, that serves that person. So being mindful of the impact can guide that question and that motivation a little bit more. We're empowered the more we know about bias and power. So when I understand that, oh, hey, this has a microaggressive element to it, that gives me power to think about, like, okay, even if I don't intend it negatively, it can be received that way. So I need to think about that. It might mean not asking the question, first of all, unless you know the person very well. I tend to ask open-ended questions rather than specific questions, especially when I'm getting to know somebody. So rather than where are you from, which is something that folks of color get asked over and over and over again in the US, rather than asking that, I might ask somebody that I'm getting to know, what is something you want to share about yourself? Like, I want to get to know you. And that way they can assess for themselves, how much do I trust you and how much do I want to share with you? It's a informed consent. Then they get to decide what they want to share and hold back, just like I do all the time, right? And then I think those caveats are really helpful too, to just kind of say like, hey, you don't owe me anything, but you were mentioning this. Do you feel comfortable sharing a little bit about that? And a person might be like, oh yeah, blah, 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 blah. And another person might say like, no, and saying like, you're right, no worries. Anyway, let's focus on this. So that's the short version.
That was very helpful. Thank you.
Is that helpful? Okay.
Yeah, that's very helpful, actually.
All right, looking at the clock, we're already a half hour in, and so I want us to transition over to a conversation of bias and power. So we talked a little bit about how microaggressions aren't just a list of bad words and good words, right? It's about power and bias. And so Liz is gonna guide us through some conversation around bias and power.
Okay. These are great questions. Thank you. Keep them coming. We'll do our best to answer everything to the best of our ability. Okay. I have the whiteboard open. What you need to do on your end in order to write on the whiteboard, if you haven't used the whiteboard before, there's 3 little dots and it says view options, and you click on annotate. And that will help you write on the whiteboard. So that's perfect. Test, yes. Although it's not anonymous. How do I change that?
So if you go into your menu, at the end should be like a more, and then there should be a hide annotators. It's something only the host can do, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Were you able to do it?
Yep, there we go. Perfect, thank you.
Yep.
So what we're going to do with the whiteboard is explore microaggressions from the context of bias and power. So to start with, in the spirit of what Ella was talking about, communal definitions and kind of thinking about, well, what does bias mean? And what does bias mean to you? What we'd like for you to do, I'm just putting the word bias, is to write, what do you think bias is? What does that mean to you? How does that resonate with you or reflect in your life? If you were to write a word or phrase, how would you maybe define it or describe it? So we'll take a second to let y'all use the whiteboard. And you can draw, you can text, hopefully it's working. If it's not working, you can always use the chat, or you can just unmute yourself and say it.
And I'll read things in the chat while you go, Liz. I know while you're sharing the whiteboard, it's hard to see the chat. So
Can we actually write on there?
Yeah, you can write on there. If
whiteboard.
you can write, so somebody's actually writing discrimination with the draw button. You can also click on the T, which is just for typing text.
You thought you were getting 2 workshops today, but you're actually getting a third just on Zoom mechanics.
I had to, Carrie, I had to double click on that T text, and then it let me type.
Okay.
Yeah.
Text in the chat, you mean?
So
No.
If you write in the chat and can't make the whiteboard work, I will read your chat.
So at the top, there's a view button.
View options.
And then you get into the, what's it called again?
Annotate.
annotate.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Jill. Thanks,
Yeah.
everyone.
All right. In the chat, someone has written prejudice.
Okay. So we have discrimination, prejudice. We have stereotypes hold toward a certain group of people. Systematic error. I just absolutely want to hear more about that one.
I really dig that definition.
I know. Double standard, slanted perspective, directional. I'm curious about that as well. Any other thoughts out there on the concept of bias that you'd like to share?
Misinterpretation.
Prejudice. Oh, and then you can stamp. So stamping, you can stamp your colleagues' statements, like with a star or a heart or whatever, just to sort of signify that you like what they said. Misinterpretation. Mm-hmm. Great. I wonder if the person who wrote systematic error, is there any chance you would unmute and talk a little more about what you mean? Of course, you don't have to. Nobody ever has to do anything in our workshops, but we are all curious and open to your thoughts. Misunderstanding from different cultures. Mm-hmm. Disproportionate weight. Okay. Sounds like folks are still wanting to include a few more things. We'll take another minute or so. Learned behavior. Yeah. Assumptions. I think when I think of bias, I very often go in my mind to socialization and how we are all socialized in our own cultural environments. You know, we're every single person in this Zoom meeting has been socialized differently, no matter how many things that we have in common. You know, we may have many things in common, many more things in common than we have differences, perhaps, or more differences in certain ways. But we're all socialized to develop our values, our beliefs, our biases about certain groups of people. We just are. And I think a big part of the work that we do, that Ella and I do in the Office for Inclusive Excellence, is to just look at that closely, to reflect on that deeply. You know, how and why do I think the things that I do? How and why do I believe the things that I do? And is that, you know, and where did that come from? And so a lot of bias is really about a lot of things that we've learned without us ever really thinking about it in a very critical way. So that's a big part of it. In the context of microaggressions, they can be negative. They can be negative stereotypes. They can be positive stereotypes too. Honestly, you know, when we think about bias, it is technically one way or the other, leaning one way or the other. When we talk about microaggressions, I think we do tend to focus on biases that maybe we don't want to hold on to. But yeah, in science, bias means a systematic error. Okay, so we got the clarification there. Yeah, it is that it is a very literal term. It can be perceived as a very literal definition, bias, but in the context of what we're talking about, it does often shift towards a bias favorably or negatively towards a particular identity or social group. And where does that come from and why do I think that? And we do often talk about it in terms of those ideas being subconscious, that we think something or act on something without even actually realizing that we are thinking those things. So I think a big part of this work that we do in our office is to start to bring these thoughts into our conscious mind. You know, why am I thinking this? Why do I think this about this particular person or group of people? Or where did that come from? Or why do I have this particular belief? And do I still believe that as a grown person? Or, you know, just kind of spending a little time really thinking about our biases can be extremely helpful as we look into our behaviors, which can come out as microaggressions. So, okay, thank you for sharing those. Okay, we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to clear this. We're going to do the same thing with the term power. Okay, so same idea. How would you define it? What words would you use? Word or phrases to define your interpretation of power? I need to move this away so I can see. Okay, positionality. Exactly. Where are you positioned in perhaps a hierarchy? Where are you positioned in terms of your identity, your social groups that you belong to? Where do they land positionality wise, intersectionality wise? Wealth, strength, institution. Somebody wrote hierarchy, yeah. Weight, decision. Mm-hmm. Culture, language, dress, zip code. Absolutely. Big part of power is very deeply rooted in the history of this country, very deeply rooted in white male dominance, very deeply rooted in who has advantages and who doesn't, who has resources and possibility and who does not. I've seen folks, right? I always try to focus a little bit on the positive, not always on the negative, because power can be used very much for good. Absolutely. Okay, just give you another minute to write there. So as we, so Ella is going to bring us into a gallery stroll, responsibility. Yep. Capacity. Mm-hmm. So Ella is going to bring us into a discussion around what are microaggressions, what are they not? But they're very much based, and the reason why we do this activity, microaggressions are based in bias and power. And it's important to think that through. Reframing deficits as asset, absolutely. Stereotype threat, stereotypes more often than not are negative. There are positive stereotypes, but we often latch onto the negative ones. The oppressed can even internalize the dominant, powerful ideology. Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, when you think about, if we're talking about socialization, if you're socialized in, you know, wherever you're socialized, wherever you grew up, however you evolved as a person with your values and beliefs, the dominant culture, whether you grew up in the United States or somewhere else, the dominant culture, even if you're not part of it, it will get internalized. You're absolutely correct there. And how does that get navigated? How do you assimilate or not assimilate? How do you challenge or not challenge the bias and power that's inherent in that? And that's an excellent point there. People with power can force someone to do something. So positive point, thank you for including a positive point, changing the world. Power does give you a little bit of a leg up on changing the world. Okay. So I'm going to shift it over to Ella, but just kind of sitting with that idea of bias and power and how that influences our behavior. What constitutes a microaggression and what doesn't? And those ideas are based in power. And I don't want to take over Ella's, I'll shift it over to you, Ella, but, you know, talking about compliments, talking about, you know, all the ways that there are times when you think the impact versus intent is such a huge part of microaggressions. So I'll shift it over so that we can keep moving because I know we don't have a ton of time. So I'm going to clear this. Thank you so much for sharing these thoughts around bias and power. This is really helpful in terms of our group thinking as we shift over to clarifying what microaggressions mean. So I'm going to stop sharing and let us communicate. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts? Or Ella, I'll let you, if you want to just kind of take it over, but if anybody wants to clarify or ask any questions about that idea of bias and power.
Yeah, happy to roll. Also happy to pause if there's a question about what we just talked about. Okay, so moving on then. So we've unpacked microaggressions a little bit, but some things I want us to keep in mind. I'm going to share a few examples of very common microaggressions. And because they're so common, it is very likely that you might have said or done one of them. And so I want us to be mindful of that before I share them, because you might find yourself reacting personally to it. And so when that happens, I want us to go back to our kind of home base, which is bias and power. So rather than thinking about, but I didn't mean it like that. In fact, that's what we call this workshop a lot of times is, but I didn't mean it like that. That's kind of a sign that it's probably microaggression. So sometimes we want to focus on our intent instead of the impact. And there's room for both, but I think it's like a 90% focus on impact and 10% on intent. So we want to address that impact first. And in order to do that, we need to remember bias and power, not our personal feelings or our intention. So how does this reify certain biases and power structures? How does it further solidify them? So we're going to share a few. Let's
Oh,
make sure.
do you have that ability, or do you need me to share?
I can if you'd like me to.
Oh, sure. Yeah, if you've got that, that sounds great, because then you can guide it on your own timing.
Okay, let me make sure. Now that I promised it, what if I can?
I have to, if you need.
There we go. All right. Okay, does everyone see it?
Oh, yeah, we didn't even come close to.
Okay, some other things to keep in mind are just paying attention to ones that you've experienced or witnessed, ones that you've done or said, and any that you don't understand why they're up here at all. So I didn't realize that that was offensive or problematic. So here is our first one. Okay, I'm just gonna pause here. So this is probably one of the most common ones, and we talked about it really quickly earlier, but the where are you from microaggression. So taking out the intention, right? Why someone might ask that, we can come back to it, but we want to start with impact, and impact is bias and power. So what's behind this? What's the unspoken message behind asking somebody where they're from? And then especially that follow-up question, where are you really from? Does anyone want to try that on? I see someone chat otherness.
You're foreign. It means you're not from here. Yeah.
Thanks, Jill. And it looks like Mongshi was saying the same thing in the chat. So this otherness, this question of belonging. Yeah, so when a person might have been born and raised in Sandy, right? But there's a feeling that you'll never belong enough. And why is that? What biases feed into that? Who gets asked this question more than others?
People of color.
Yeah, folks of color, absolutely. And that's because we make a mistake in our biased thinking. We might think that geography equals race. And that's not true. Great. Who else gets
Can I say something? It has actually happened to me with my students that I assume that they were from a different country, that they were immigrants just as I am, because they look from a different country. And then it turned out that they were born here.
Right.
You know, but it also happened the other way around. I have had Caucasian students that look super Caucasian, but in reality, they are, one of their parents is actually, you know, from like a different race, or and it's mind blowing, and it has humbled me, both experiences, because it also shows how bias it's also internalized in us, people of color.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Carrie. Yeah, we have all internalized this, right? So even if I can get to a place where my conscious mind says, don't do that again, that's biased, right? That we've internalized that bias for so long, sometimes we might still slip up. And also because when we're talking about racism, we are talking about a power dynamic as much as anything else. We're all susceptible to racist thoughts and ideas and assumptions. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Carrie. And to highlight the fact that we can both be harmed by a microaggression and cause a microaggression. It's absolutely possible. All right. So I said that we can go back to intent after we address impact. The intent behind this might just be trying to get to know somebody, right? So the reason why it's important to circle back to intent is to figure out less harmful ways to accomplish that same intent. If what I'm trying to do is to get to know somebody, I can say, tell me a little bit about yourself, right? So we talked about that a little bit earlier. But if I will say that I've been asked where I'm from, but I am always believed as a white person when people say, where are you from? And I say, Utah and West Texas, people go, cool. I've never been asked where are you really from, right? So there's some racism behind that question. There's some xenophobia behind that question. And there's some ethnocentric thinking behind that question. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to go a little bit faster after this. I just wanted to kind of highlight that unpacking together for this first one. So the next ones, I'm going to stay silent and we'll just answer questions about them at the end if you have them. So the board says, oh, I wouldn't have expected you to be a science major. Are you a man or a woman? You're really pretty for a dark-skinned girl after the ellipses. So like, what are you? So who's the man in the relationship? So what does your hair look like today? She said as she pulled off my hat without my permission. You don't speak Spanish? Why do you sound white? All right. I'm going to go ahead and stop share. Were there any questions about why some of those are microaggressions? Do we need to unpack any? Were there any that stuck out to you that you want to talk about?
Well, I was a bit surprised about the one, like your major, you don't look like a science major, because I don't know, I don't think that would be intentionally aggressive, you know?
Yeah.
I think it may be about stereotypes, you know, like scientists are supposed, I don't know, maybe to wear glasses, I'm not sure, you know, something. But I wouldn't think that it was like aggressive, like negatively aggressive, right?
Yeah.
So there are some stereotypes that are not aggressive or mean, even though there are stereotypes.
That's a really good thing to bring up. So remember when we talked about what microaggressions are and aren't? They are not necessarily aggressive. So please don't confuse them with an intent to harm. So aggression is wading into intent, right? So if we come back to impact, if we just think about bias and power, in fact, and Liz alluded to this earlier, but a microaggression can absolutely be a compliment, right? I can say something trying to compliment someone, and that person can even receive it as a compliment, and it can still be a microaggression because it's not about hurt feelings. It's not about aggression. It's about bias and power. So if we look into that, you don't look like a science major, instead of focusing on intention, if we focus on bias and power, what comes up? What's the unspoken message behind that? Not the intention, but the unspoken message.
Yeah, there is a type for science, and that person is not fitting that type. It's a bias, right?
Yeah, and so what might be those biases? Carrie, you unmuted. Did you have something you wanted to say?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to build on my example, but in regards to what Maribel was saying, I mean, it all depends what that question is being addressed to, because if that person is a woman, it happened to be a woman, like I would feel insulted. Like, what do you mean? Like, you know, because we know the genderized aspect of like science. We know that there are way less women in the science field than men. Maybe it depending on my ethnicity or my race, I might also feel insulted, you know, as well as when I've been told you don't look like Mexican, and then people tell me, even though if I don't keep asking, like, oh, you look more like Spanish or Italian, and like that might feel like a compliment for some people, although for me it's like, what does that mean? You know, that maybe I don't look that brown, that I look a little bit more white. But of course, like I've had like plenty of time to read about all these relations of power, and maybe some people will not find it offensive.
Yeah.
And maybe at this point, I don't really find it that offensive either, because I know that the other person on the other side might ignore all these relations of power and all these things too.
Yeah, and the goal for this, by being able to name and address microaggressions, the goal isn't what I call social justice bingo. It's not about saying like racism, check, sexism. I'm not suggesting that there is only one way to react or respond to these things. It might be an education lens, to your point, Carrie. It might be that like, oh, you might not know this, but when you say this, this is how it's heard. And our responses are varied. It's contextual, right? So there are times when my response to a microaggression that I hear over and over and over again, it might be that it's a stranger at a track station and I might just want to go home. And so my response might be just survival, right? And that's valid. And then in another context, if it's, somebody that I'm getting to know and trust or I work with every day, I might have a different response because I need to build a relationship with that person. If it's my mom, gosh, I better have some love and care in my thinking because I know where that microaggression is coming from. That's my home. I have similar biases. So by pretending that I don't have them, I don't get very far. To be able to say, oh, mom, I love you. I used to think that too. And then I heard this, right? So having a different response in different contexts absolutely makes sense. So again, we're not suggesting that the goal is to throw people away. The goal is to be able to name it so that this is power, right? So when I know that by saying, you don't look like a science major, that I'm causing unintended harm, I can check that bias. I can have some cultural humility and some personal humility and behave in a different way. But I can say like, and it is important to name those power structures and those biases. So just like earlier, we're saying this has to do with racism. Who gets asked where they're from has everything to do with race, has everything to do with accent. Absolutely. So when I know that, then I can think about the biases I have around those topics. When I know that who gets told that they don't look like a science major is predominantly a sexism problem, then I can check my relationship with sexism. I can check my relationship with how I treat women and femmes, right? And then if I'm complimented by it, I love that reflection. I've absolutely been complimented by things that hurt me at different times in my life. And it has taken time for me to unpack maybe and think, maybe that's not a compliment. Why was I feeling so good about that? And Carrie, your point was, I think they're meaning that I look more white. Like that doesn't feel so good anymore, right? And for me, absolutely. I've had compliments where people say, oh, I forget you're trans or you don't look transgender. And I think, and there was a time early in my life where that might have felt good. Unfortunately, I wish it didn't. But as I reflect back, it did. And now I think, why do I need to not look like myself in order to be good? That's a problem, right? But that takes work, and it doesn't mean that every person in a certain community feels the same way. So that's kind of some microaggression bias and power unpacking for you. And we've got only a half an hour left, so I want to be mindful. Normally in a 90-minute microaggression workshop, this is where we start doing some skill building, where we talk about how to respond, how we think about context, how we think about positionality. I love that positionality got put on the whiteboard in our conversation of power, because how I respond and how you respond, Maribel, in the same exact situation, of course, would be different. We're different people. We have different identities. We have different power, oppression, and relationship, right? So you might, the best response for you might be to say something, and it might be for me to be quiet, or vice versa. It might be for me to say something and for you to say agreed, or whew. It might just be a grunt. It might just not even be words, just saying, just showing that I don't necessarily agree, but I just want to get out of here. There's so many responses. But we'll leave that at that, just that introduction. And Liz, if you want to take it away and guide us into some inclusion teaching and some syllabus work.
Okay. Well, I don't want to stop this conversation. I mean, but let's sort of morph into talking a little bit about teaching. So all of the things that we just talked about are, a huge part of inclusive teaching is recognizing all of this in the classroom. It's just essentially just taking everything that we just talked about and putting ourselves in the teacher and student classroom environment, and it's all the same. And what ends up happening is there are certain things that happen in the classroom that are pretty common. And I've worked a lot with faculty. I've been in this position for almost 3 years. And there's a lot of very similar situations that continue to come up for faculty in terms of this intention of creating an inclusive classroom. I really want to create a classroom where the students feel, we often use the term safe. We don't really use the term safe so much. There's the brave versus safe article that has probably got, a trillion, hits or whatever. But it's a wonderful reframing that you can't necessarily guarantee something. You can't really guarantee anything for your student. You certainly can't guarantee safety. This idea of shifting it from safe to brave, I like that idea. I like that idea of let's be brave together in our learning and challenge each other and respect each other and how we're communicating across difference. We're for sure going to have different opinions, different perspectives on any given topic based on all the things that we just said around bias and power and socialization. We're all coming to this classroom with completely different spaces. So when it comes to inclusive teaching, and I do want to try and make sure that we have some time for small groups, although this is a pretty small group, so maybe we don't have to worry about that too much. But the premise of inclusive teaching, it's very heavily researched. It's very heavily researched, is that the intention by the faculty in terms of creating a classroom climate that is where you show your own vulnerability to some degree, and that's going to be different depending on who you are as a person and who you are as a faculty. If you are a white male tenured faculty, your level of vulnerability is going to look very different than if you are a non-tenured career line woman of color faculty. So it's different based on who you are and what identities you bring into the classroom. But the idea is you want to create this space. And so what are some strategies to do this, to create a classroom climate where the students know that you care about them, where you've provided opportunities for the students to learn from each other, and then you have the whole purpose of the course, which is whatever those learning outcomes are. That is completely discipline dependent. It's course dependent. So that's what I want to talk about a little bit. And I think maybe since we are time constrained, I'm going to focus on the syllabus. So I'm going to share my screen and hold on one sec. Let me open this up. I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to just focus on, I'll do my best to kind of move through, but I want to focus on the syllabus because I think because it's a very tangible, it represents your whole course, right? Your syllabus represents your whole course. I was just talking to a faculty today thinking about spring. What does your syllabus look like? What is an inclusive syllabus? And, I think, she said, in a lot of disciplines, so I'm not sure exactly what your situation is in terms of your syllabus, but a lot of disciplines, you get handed a template and you're like, well, okay, this is my syllabus. This is what I have to work with. So then you can kind of add on and change things from there. And there is some more flexibility in some disciplines more than others. But there's this sort of feeling that she was like, I don't know, I haven't even really looked at my syllabus. And I thought, well, if you haven't looked at your syllabus, your students definitely have not looked at your syllabus, right? So it's like this idea of your syllabus to some degree embodies who you are and what you value. And it is a piece of paper. It is a document. It's something you post on Canvas. But I think it actually, because it's so tangible, you have to go through and think through it. What statements am I putting in there? What are the due dates? Where are my policies? I think we underestimate the power of the syllabus, honestly, and how much it can actually support an inclusive classroom climate. So I'm going to focus on that. I'm going to share my screen here. I want to talk a little bit about the principles, and then I'll dive into what an inclusive syllabus is. Okay, share screen. Okay, here we go. Okay, so principles. I already kind of said this, but am I not able to, hold on. Okay, mindset. Okay, so it is a mindset, this idea of inclusive teaching. That's what I was saying, this intentionality, that it's how you view teaching. It's how I think about teaching. It's, I am determined, I want to do everything I can to support all the diversity in my classroom. In terms of all the students and everything that they bring to this classroom. It's equity minded. So that means that we are thinking about all of the inequities that are occurring in higher education and society at large. Which students are coming to my classroom with all of the K-12 resources and which students are not. Who's coming with the study skills? Who's coming with parents and grandparents that have been to college, and who's first generation, so really thinking about it from an equity minded lens. And then there's, as I said, there's a lot of research on this, but classroom environment, the way that students feel, whether or not they feel that they belong in that classroom, it makes all the difference. It's not even, does it support student learning? It is, if students feel like they belong, they will do enormously better in that classroom. If they do not feel like they belong in that classroom, they will not perform. They will either drop out or they will not perform to the best of their ability. So it's hugely important. So these are a few other pieces around, the principles, but valuing students' diversity and their backgrounds and identities, and finding ways to incorporate that into your course, whether that's through their lived experiences, through their assignments. I'm sure that you all have seen the research around diversity, creating a more enriched educational experience. It's also, if you move away from higher education, there's so much research around corporations and productivity and the bottom line. And, corporations do so much better and make so much more money, if you have diversity in the organization, particularly in the leadership. So it's the same thing at the university, and that students do learn better. That doesn't mean that there aren't challenges. And I want to talk about some of those, especially in a predominantly white institution and environment like the University of Utah. So inclusive teaching incorporates a lot of things. It's a broad thing. So we're just going to dive in and talk about the syllabus, but it does cover content and design. It covers the pedagogy, how you teach, and your essentially your philosophy and view of teaching, how you create this climate in your classroom, all the strategies, all the things that you can do to really build trust in your classroom, where students feel like you care about them, you care about who they are as people, and that you've provided some opportunities for students to learn from each other. And then I personally think the most important part of this work is your own self-reflection. Where are your biases? What stereotypes do you hold about students and their potential for learning? So there's all that kind of work there around self-reflection. I'm moving quickly. Okay, so number one, getting to know your students. There's all kinds of ways to do that. Certainly your Canvas profile, you can put your own name and pronoun if you choose. Using a student survey, which really, you can ask all kinds of questions. You're not asking what race are you or anything like that. I mean, you can ask certainly their name and pronoun. And questions about their experience with the content is really helpful. Certainly you can ask about, a hobby or just, getting to know them kind of question. But the most important question is there anything that you need me to know about you so that I can support you in your learning? It's that same kind of way that Ella was just saying, instead of saying, where are you from? It's, is there something that you would like? I'd love to get to know you better. Is there anything you'd like to share with me? It's the same premise. So it's not asking some direct question that a student may not want to answer. It's opening up this space of kind of building trust. Is there anything that you feel, I'm your faculty, I'm your instructor in this class, I want to get to know you. Is there anything you'd like me to know so that I can support you in your learning? That would be helpful for me to know. Please share it here. So that's really what the survey is about, is getting to know your students in that way, not in kind of these boxed ways, but certainly asking some fun questions is always helpful because, you know, we're human and it's fun to share things. So that's important, but that particular question in particular. And then the digital storytelling. I said digital because we're in the virtual online environment. But some kind of way, if you don't have any tools there, you know, around how can students sort of talk to each other through video or share something through discussion boards. If you haven't done that before, oh, somebody's in the waiting room, it just popped up. If you haven't done any kind of communal get to know you with students and with you, there's so many ways to do that. It's totally, you know, up to you as the faculty, whether it's video or whether it's discussion or a written assignment that you share or anything, but some kind of capacity of getting to know your students. So this is a big piece. I'm just looking at the time. Okay. This is content related. So we're going to dive into the syllabus here, but a big part of inclusivity in academia right now, well, always, but right now in particular, is we really are trying to address diversity, inclusivity, equity, anti-racism in academia, is the content that you are teaching. And academia is absolutely based in colonization. It's based in white male perspective. The canon, you know, depending on what your discipline is and who is considered, whose voices are heard and who's considered the expert, being so mindful of incorporating as many voices as you can. So that's an important part as you look at your syllabus, is who is speaking in your course, who is speaking through your syllabus and into the content of what you're trying to teach your students, and how much diversity of representation is in there. So really thinking about that. And that can be your textbook, that can be a case study that you design, it can be examples that you use as you're teaching. So really thinking about BIPOC, if you're not familiar with that term, it's Black, Indigenous, people of color contributions to your discipline. And then especially right now in the pandemic, how are you incorporating students' lived experiences into your course content? Finding some way to, whether it's an assignment or some kind of interactive activity, if you're, you know, doing synchronous teaching, some kind of way to have your students talk about what they're going through in a contextual way, you know, that it's content related, that of course that it's you know, course learning outcome related, but you pulling that in some way. Okay, two more slides and then we'll dive into discussion. I already talked about diverse content. Accessibility is a big one. That's something that Canvas is getting much better at, Zoom is getting much better at, but thinking about all the different ways that you can make your digital virtual class more accessible for folks. Having really clear lines of communication, especially when you're in a virtual world, having that communication be really specific and really ongoing is really important. And that is very personal. So for some faculty, it's, I only work during the week. I do not respond to emails on the weekend, and I will respond to emails up until 5 p.m. during the, whatever it is, but making that clear to your students so they know how to communicate with you. The varied methods piece is based on universal design for learning. So that comes from architecture. So it's actually, it's similar to accessibility, but has been translated into teaching and learning, where thinking about how, in what ways are you imparting the content? In what ways are you teaching? Is it all lecture? To what degree are you incorporating small group activities? To what degree are you using technology? To what degree are you trying to provide this information in a variety of ways? So if you're lecturing, is that lecture recorded and available at a later time for students? So the varied methods piece is around providing the teaching in a varied in a variety of ways, but also allowing your students to demonstrate their learning in a variety of ways. So that might be whether it's video, whether it's writing, whether it's, you know, all the different ways. And it's so discipline dependent. So it's not that you should now think, oh gosh, you know, I should be doing this or that. But it's a moment to reflect on, do I have my students only do 2 papers and that's their whole grade? Or do I only have a midterm and a final and that's their whole grade? That can be very difficult for a lot of student learners. So thinking about having a variety of ways for students to demonstrate their learning. And if you have any questions about ways to do that, that is our job, is to help you with that. Lastly is the tone of your syllabus. So I would be so grateful if you want to send me your syllabus. I have another team member now, Tisha Kofi, that is so wonderful in the Office for Inclusive Excellence. And we are accepting syllabi now. We're accepting syllabi and would love to help you with your spring syllabus in terms of this whole idea of what is an inclusive syllabus. What's the tone and language that you're using? Does it sound like when a student reads it, do they want to drop your class or are they excited? I mean, really read your syllabus. If you read it as a student, would you want to take that class or not? Like, does it sound like if you, on pain of, you know, if you don't meet this due date, you will fail? I mean, that's what a lot of syllabi sound like. So thinking about the tone, being extremely clear. So that's another thing within being inclusive, does not mean being lenient necessarily. It's being very clear with your expectations. That's what inclusivity actually is about. These are my guidelines. These are my policies. These are my due dates. And it's not just if you don't turn this in at this time. It's about this is why. This is why I'm asking you to turn this in at this time. This is why I'm asking you to do this assignment in this way. That's what transparency is. And then there's an inclusivity statement that I'll read to you here as an example. And then absolutely, even if you aren't running a discussion-based course, having some discussion guidelines and behavior expectations that you've either presented to your students or come up with your students is even better if you have the time, is really important. So I have this example of an inclusivity statement, but I'm going to, we are running out of time. Okay, I'm gonna stop share for a second because we only have 12 minutes. So it's going to talk a little bit about inclusive climate and some more strategies there, but a lot of that is around what I was just saying in terms of role modeling as a faculty. The energy that you bring to your classroom it's more important than almost anything that you could do as an instructor, as a faculty. But really thinking about that role modeling piece, thinking about inclusive language, which is a lot of what we just talked about around bias and power and microaggressions. I'm going to leave it with this one piece, and I want to make sure we have the 10 minutes to talk. One of the biggest things that has come up in these workshops and that faculty have some of the biggest concerns is when something gets said in the class that is problematic. That can look a lot of different ways. So a very common one in a predominantly white institution like the University of Utah is a conservative white male student that says something like, oh, well, you know, I'm the most discriminated against population now, or there's so many examples. And you as a faculty have done all this work to create a space where you are so wanting this space to be as inclusive and respectful as it possibly can be, to the power that you have. And all kinds of things can happen in that space, just like it can happen in any space. So your job, of course, as a faculty is to respond. And so that's where I'm going to leave it, is regardless of what gets said in your classroom or in life, as we move through thinking about microaggressions and how we respond, it is your job as the faculty to respond and say something, even if it's a grunt, like Ella said, because sometimes we just freeze. We just freeze and you don't know what to say, or you can't even believe that you heard it, or maybe you don't know that you heard it right. You probably all have an example of this. So I'm going to turn it over now to questions, comments, and start. We don't have a whole lot of time for skill building, but I do want to make sure that the last few minutes that we have is focused on that. Situations that maybe have arisen and how to respond, because your job as faculty, let me just say one more thing. I'm so sorry. I'm blabbing. I'm trying to just talk fast. Your job as faculty is not to change students' minds as much as you would like to think that. Like, how is this student thinking this, and how is this student saying this? Your job is to present the truth and the information about the content and the learning outcomes of that course. And if you change a student's mind, that is the brilliance of teaching. But that isn't your job. And that is what is so hard and scary about being in this space of teaching, where your job is to teach this content and not to change somebody's mind. That is, only that student can do that. But maybe you can. Maybe you can. Okay, so I'm going to zip it. We only have 8 minutes. I'm going to zip it. Does anyone have questions, thoughts, comments, Ella, anything? That was so fast.
I've never had my name used as a question, thought, comment, Ella before. That was cute.
Thought, comment, Ella?
So I really hope that much more people would have taken this workshop, because I just found it so valuable, you know, reflecting with you about all these things. So I thank Jill for inviting us. Like, thank you, Jill. And I just like love how you address many things that maybe I never thought about. For example, that in the syllabus we could not be inclusive. So that's something that for sure I'm gonna keep that in mind. I'm not talking about the curriculum, but you know, those things that in the syllabus we state as if you don't submit this on time, shalala, and how things could sound for, you know, for students.
Especially before they've met you. I mean, I have seen
I
stuff
never thought about it.
written from the university. It's like, it is, I should include, I'm going to include that when I do this presentation again. I mean, there's something that came, I think it's 10 years old or something, but it's like, the faculty responsibility is to, you know, check. I'm saying that tone because literally that's what it sounds like to me when I read it. It's like, if you don't treat each other respectfully, it was like, the process will come into play where you will be removed from the class and you will fail this class. That was what it said. It wasn't like, hey, you know what would be great is if we just, you know, came into this class and really communicated with each other respectfully and really sought to learn from each other. No, it was like, I was reading the syllabus and I was like, it was awful. I'm not even in the class, and I would never, I would drop that class immediately. So I do think that the tone that we set is incredibly important. Incredibly important.
Liz, there was a question in the chat from Maribel about whether or not you could share a model syllabus.
Mm-hmm.
So I just
Sure.
wanted to bring that forward.
I wouldn't be able to pull it up in time in the chat, but I'm happy to share it. Absolutely.
I've seen faculty stress equity and social justice so much that they hammer a student and shame them in front of class for misspeaking. And so I would like to know, I feel like I'm at the point where I would like to understand better how our dedication to social justice can be implemented in a way that acknowledges that everyone's learning and that we have to facilitate, like you said, the reflection by our students. We can't tell them how to think differently. That doesn't work. So I feel like that's where I wish maybe we could go next, you know, and I don't know if you're willing to facilitate that for a different session.
Oh, I'd be happy to do that. And I know Ella has so many thoughts on that. But I will agree that the whole point of this work is to create space where people can be apart from, okay, no, I just used all the wrong language because you said apart from. That was the exact opposite of what I was trying to say. We're trying to create a space where everyone is included, where everyone is respected. And that does include folks that are conservative. And there's this idea that, you know, the liberal bastion and all of those things. So that doesn't mean you do not name what is happening. So if somebody is saying and doing something as a student, and they're saying and doing something that is racist or sexist or transphobic or homophobic or whatever, xenophobic, whatever it might be, you don't not name it. But shaming is the worst thing that you can do, especially in a classroom. I mean, in general, but especially in a classroom. So that is where you might have to completely pause. It just depends. And that's where it's so contextual. You might have to completely pause and just say, oh, okay. You know what? I'm not comfortable with what was just being said. And I see that where you're coming from. And that's not the direction that we want to go here. And I want to come back to that. And I think actually we need to come back to that next class. And I want to assign a reading. And I want to come back to that because this is a really important discussion to have. And I want to respect where you're coming from, so-and-so. But right now, I'm perceiving that as being something that is problematic. And maybe you name it then, like as being racist or being whatever you want to name it as. It's fine. It's imperative to name things for what they are. And you can do that without shaming. Because the second you start shaming, and Ella may have a different perspective on that. That's the perspective that I've had in my own experience in the classroom. But the second you start shaming, you've lost that person. That person who has that perspective, who is saying things about, you know, white folks or whatever it is. The second you shame that person, you've lost them. They won't come back. They won't come back to that classroom discussion. And it may be a long time, if ever, if they come back into that fold. And so that's my perspective on that. And that's one perspective. I'm so open to hearing your all's thoughts because there's no one way to do this. Absolutely not. But that is a huge issue in classrooms, is exactly what you're talking about, Jill. Oh my gosh, it's 4:29. Jeez Louise. Ella, do you have any thoughts on that? Like just the idea of, you know, in the classroom with.
Oh, the 60-second version I would give would be, I think, yeah, there's a few things there, right? So there's a real calculus to the moment that takes a lot of context that I don't want to assume too much around. Everything's going to be a little different. I think some kind of guiding principles I try to live by is I'm a mess too, like not holding yourself somehow as some expert that is infallible. And I think there can be a power in leading with that. There's sometimes nothing more vulnerable than sharing your own mess a little bit instead of being an expert in front of a classroom, but saying like, You know, here's a common misconception. I've made that mistake before too, but leading with your own learning process can help as an experiential model of learning. The other thing I would say is be very suspicious of your motivations. Sometimes, especially if the topic is one of race and racism, I would say for a white person in that conversation, there hasn't been a lot of good modeling on how to be a white person that can navigate conversations of race and racism. And so sometimes our over-the-top reaction to racist rhetoric, racist behavior, can have more to do with our own insecurity and fragility as white people, trying to overcompensate for where we've come from. That's just an example. I think there's some other parallels to be drawn or similarities that you could pull from other experiences, but I try to be suspicious of, am I trying to shut that person down as a way to make myself feel better? But yeah, there is the calculus also includes sometimes we're not going to have every moment feel great. I almost always feel like I overreacted or underreacted, that I went too hard or I went too soft. And just thinking about the long game of that, especially if you're teaching over the course of a semester or a year, thinking about how I can weave this into multiple conversations. Very rarely will one-off conversations be enough or be adequate to these topics. And so thinking about how I can address this piece and this piece and this piece, scaffold it, is really, really important. Some folks respond best to articles, some folks respond best to humanity and kind of a personal interaction with it. If you're personally impacted by the harmful rhetoric that is shared by your students, I think that's another element to consider. So if it's racist rhetoric and you're a person of color, being mindful of like what you can and can't do in that moment, how to preserve and self-care, how to survive the feedback sessions that are going to come from your students. Again, positionality is everything too. For me, it's actually easier to navigate transphobic rhetoric than it is many other things, just because with that, I feel like I have some pretty solid ground to stand on, you know? And so just thinking about like why I feel more comfortable in this topic than I do in that topic, and doing our homework, and trying to, oh gosh, man, I went on and on, sorry. Last thing I'd say is be careful of thinking, scapegoating rural folks and conservative folks. I think there's a lot of that happens in Salt Lake. I come from country, I come from rural places, and so I'm very sensitive to it. I think that I experienced just as much racism, transphobia, all of that from liberal folks in academia as I did in rural places. And so it might look differently. It might have more of a subtlety to it, but it's just as insidious. So thinking about like how my mess actually looks, and how I can address it best. Holding accountability and education at the same time. Whew, sorry.
We went over. Oh, darn. I know we were trying to pack too much in. We should probably not say that we can do 2 different workshops in one, but we tried. Hopefully there's some thoughts there, and please reach out. Please do feel free to send a syllabus if you would like some help with assessing your syllabus and thinking it through, and what does it look like? What does it sound like? Having an external eye on it. Please do send it to me and Ella, and we'll take a look. Oh, emails, yeah. Yep.
Yeah, I'll share my email. I also love what Maribel shared in the chat. So
Yeah.
thinking about our position of power.
And
Our
kind
silence is viewed as complicity.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I think that thinking through that position of power as faculty is so important in so many ways, and all the ways that you do have power as faculty, all the ways that maybe your power is undermined by other aspects of your identity and who's in the classroom and trying to undermine your power and authority and expertise. And just remembering that, yeah, your job is to impart, you know, this content, but it is very difficult to, I love that you said that, Ella, about scapegoating with the whole conservative. I mean, there is so much about higher ed and this idea of conservative students saying, oh, I can't share what I want to say because I'll just get shut down, and everybody's so liberal and faculty are also liberal. And you've got to, as faculty, you've got to open that space up. You've got to open that space up so that everybody feels that, you know, but also naming things that need to be named. You know, so that's that balance. It's so contextual. It's challenging. You all have the hardest job.
Mhm.
Hardest job. Teaching is the hardest job. And I just wish after this pandemic that the country starts to value it for what it really is. I've been K-12 teacher. I've been a higher ed teacher. And wow, if this country could actually start to value education for what it really is.
Well, I just want to say thanks, everybody. So
Thank you.
I really
Thank you,
appreciate
everyone.
getting to learn with you for a little while.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah, thank you, Liz and Gabriella. That was really, really great. Yeah, we really appreciate you coming to share your insights. I thought that was a really great workshop. And thanks everyone for joining. Once again, you know, at the very late of the semester, and we appreciate you being here. And then I will follow up with email about the with the link to the video. And also, I think someone asked for like a model syllabus.
Mhm.
So and I'll share that once I have that from you guys.
Okay.
All right.
Sounds good. I will send that for sure.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.